So, Pastor Dave gave me the topic of reconciliation to speak on today. I'm not quite sure exactly what number it is in the series, but we've been looking at a series on what we can learn from the story of Jacob. Most families, many families, have disagreements. Some last for days, some last for years. Sometimes people haven't spoken to each other for decades. Genesis 33 is about two brothers like that, Jacob and Esau. They haven't spoken to each other for 20 years. And this passage is about whether they can be reconciled to each other. Just briefly where I'm going today, I'm going to look at reconciliation as a theme in the Bible and ask whether it's relevant to today. I'm going to think about what was the background to the dispute between Jacob and Esau. What had they disagreed about? Then what happened when Jacob fled? The steps before they met. What happens when they meet? And finally some next steps. But first of all, just reconciliation as a theme in the Bible is not something we always see, even when it's there. For example, when I was younger, there was a musical about Jacob's favourite son, Joseph, who takes up 14 chapters at the end of Genesis. Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. If you see the modern telling of this story, it seems to be about the idea that dreams and ambition are worth pursuing. Or Joseph's resilience, he's sold into slavery, but he ends up wealthy and powerful. Or maybe it's about optimism, when things seem to be out of control. Anyone from anywhere can make it if they get a lucky break. But actually, really, the Bible story is about reconciliation. It's how the brothers who nearly killed Joseph to get rid of him and who sold him into slavery were ultimately reconciled to him, and the whole family came back together. So when we see things with a biblical mindset rather than sometimes the way modern people tell it, reconciliation is a repeating theme in the Bible. It was the theme of the prodigal son, which Rico spoke about 3 weeks ago, a story that Jesus told. Ultimately, the good news is that we can be reconciled to God because of what Jesus has done for us in dying on the cross. You could say that reconciliation between us and God is the big theme of the whole gospel. But God is not just interested in our reconciliation to him. Often he wants us to be reconciled to others. As Paul puts it in Romans 12, verse 17 to 18, do not repay anyone evil for evil. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And Jesus spoke about coming to God in worship, Matthew 5. So if you're offering your gift on the altar, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. That reconciliation may not be easy. It may require humility and making amends. Reconciliation in the Bible is usually costly in one way or another. But it seems that God is sending Jacob back to meet his brother because God's purpose is that they can be reconciled. This takes place probably on the east side of the River Jordan, north of the Dead Sea. Jacob has come from the far north, well off the map, north and the east, probably in what is now modern-day northern Syria. And Esau has come from Seir, off the map to the south, but they meet here. This takes place probably around about the 18th century BC, or even earlier, a very long time ago. But I think that the idea of family rivalry, breakdown of relationships, and a need for reconciliation are just as much a thing today as they were then. I was thinking of a modern example of reconciliation. One that I came up with is Nelson Mandela, the first black president of South Africa. He'd been in prison for 27 years. He could have held a huge grudge and a desire for vengeance because of all the bad things that were done to him and the people he represented under the apartheid regime. He could have been out for vengeance, but instead he considered the best way to build a new society in South Africa was to pursue reconciliation. That needed the truth to come out, and it was in no way an easy process, but he saw it as the best way to build a better society in the future. I'm not saying you have to agree with everything Mandela did, but I think his emphasis on reconciliation rather than, say, vengeance was a better way to rebuild. And he was given a Nobel Peace Prize for his work to end the apartheid regime. More personally, maybe there's someone you need to be reconciled with. A colleague who you fell out with, a family member, a friend who treated you badly, someone who victimized you. Or maybe you're the one in the wrong, and now you think it's time to put things right with somebody you mistreated. It may be many years ago. In Jacob's case, it was 20 years ago. Have a think about it before God and what you can do to seek reconciliation. Has God been telling you to go and seek reconciliation with someone? And if you'd like to pray with someone, talk with someone after the service, please do come and talk to one of the leaders. Jacob is not exactly a textbook example. His name means deceiver, and he certainly lived up to that. He didn't tell the truth, and he wronged people. And Pastor Dave recently spoke about Jacob's family life, which is more like a soap opera. He's had a dozen children with 4 different women. And yet, there are things we can learn from him. So what was the dispute between Jacob and Esau about? Jacob had taken Esau's birthright, even though Esau was a slightly older brother. Jacob had their mother's favour, while Esau had their father's favour, so there was a split in the family. And Jacob had deceived their father Isaac to get his blessing, which Isaac had intended for Esau. Jacob's outward sins are lying and stealing, but the underlying problem is a greediness for personal wealth and for prestige and advancement, even at the expense of others. And lastly, they were just very different people. Esau is the big brother, physically strong, a hunter, whereas Jacob, as the Bible puts it, stayed at home in tents. And Esau was antagonistic to Jacob. In chapter 27, verse 41, he said to himself, "When the time for grieving my father arrives, I shall kill Jacob, my brother." So Jacob had fled. In fact, he went several hundred miles away, off the map that I showed. Even that was a deception. His mother complained to Isaac that Jacob shouldn't marry among the local Hittite women, that it wasn't appropriate. So Isaac had sent Jacob away back to his relatives to find a wife. But the real reason was she was afraid Esau would kill Jacob. But now 20 years have passed. It's at least 20 years since Jacob and Esau have seen each other. 7 years working for Laban, his uncle, in order to marry Leah, and then 7 more years working after marrying Rachel, and 6 more years working to build up the flock. During that time, Jacob's had 11 sons, one still to come, and a daughter with 2 wives and 2 other women. So a lot has happened in that time. But maybe Jacob has been thinking for all those years that one day he would go back to Canaan. Maybe he's been living with a fear of Esau for 20 years. And recently, things have not been working out so well with Laban, and God has told Jacob explicitly to go back. You can see in Genesis 31, verse 3 and verse 13. Well, what will happen when he meets Esau again? What would you have done in Jacob's situation? Before they meet, Jacob admits his fear, he prays honestly, and he wrestles with God. At least you can see in Genesis 32 verse 9, he's doing the right thing, I think, praying to God, even though that's just in fear of his life. He remembers and he reminds God in prayer about God's promises to him, that he'd be going back to Canaan, and that God had told him recently to do that. And in verse 11, Jacob prays for safety and deliverance from attack for himself and his family. I don't know how you are with prayer, but I've noticed in the past that when I've prayed about reconciliation with someone, prayed for an opportunity to put things right and sort out a relationship, I've had answers to those prayers quickly. Much more quickly than when I prayed for a Ferrari. I'm still waiting for that. But seriously, I have prayed about reconciliation and I've noticed God answers those prayers quickly. Jacob sent messengers on ahead to find out what to expect from Esau. And they came back saying, "We met Esau and he's coming to meet you with 400 men." So Jacob was still afraid, and he had good reason to be. We can see in chapter 32 verse 7 to 12 how he was in fear and distress. Esau could attack him, his family and his flocks. And it takes two to achieve reconciliation. Normally it's not going to work if it's one-sided. It needs two people to be reconciled to each other. You can't force somebody to be reconciled to you. There's a real risk that they won't want it. However, as the verse in Romans that I mentioned earlier says, the right thing to do, as far as it depends on you, is seek to live in peace with people. So even if you're rejected, it's right to try. And I think that's why Jacob tries to placate Esau by sending gifts. In the last chapter, he sent 3 gifts of animals on ahead as a gift for Esau. It was a valuable gift. In those days, your wealth could be seen in what flocks you had, not in your bank account, not in a big house or a car, but it was flocks that were a measure of wealth. So Jacob is offering these to Esau to make amends and try and put things right. Esau initially refuses the gifts, but eventually accepts them. The price for reconciliation for us may not be measured in sheep and goats, but often there is a price to be paid. It may be swallowing our pride. It may be admitting we did wrong. It may be giving up on vengeance, even though we have good reason for vengeance. Is there a price for you in seeking reconciliation with someone? Are you willing to pay it? I don't know your situation and what I may be raising here. I do know it's not cheap. But I think Jesus would want us to seek reconciliation, and he paid a big price for us. Jacob aims to reduce the risk by splitting his own family into groups. He most wants to protect Rachel and Joseph, so he puts them in the rear group, Leah and her children in a group in front of them, and the other women and children in a group in front of them. And he puts himself at the front in the most dangerous place to protect those behind him. So what happens when they meet? In verse 3, Jacob bows before Esau. He's showing respect. He's demonstrating humility. This is the opposite of what he'd been like in earlier chapters, where he'd taken Esau's birthright and blessing. Blessing in biblical times is about giving someone honor and status. And Jacob had wanted the blessing Isaac intended for Esau. That was seeking honor and status for himself. Bowing shows a changed heart. Jacob is different from what he was like 20 years ago. He's showing he's learned humility, not just in that he bows to Esau, but in the way he speaks. When Esau asks him about his family, he says, not in a boastful way, these are my children, this is something I've achieved, but these are what God has given me. And he refers to himself in verse 5 as your servant. Reconciliation usually requires showing humility. I reckon both Jacob's bowing and the gifts that he sent show that he recognizes he's hurt Esau. What's missing in the passage that I would have liked to see is an actual apology in so many words. Sorry seems to be the hardest word. Whereas in the story of the prodigal son, which Rico spoke about 3 weeks ago, the prodigal goes back to his father and says, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." Jacob doesn't manage to find similar words to say that. But I think maybe the gifts he sent and his bowing before Esau are meant to have a similar meaning. And actually, in the end, Esau does show grace and forgiveness to Jacob, even though he might not have done. Esau had a small army with him. He could have taken revenge on Jacob, but he doesn't. He forgave. Esau wants to be reconciled to Jacob, and it is a two-way thing. And Jacob actually recognizes this grace and forgiveness. In Genesis 33, verse 10, he says, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God." Actually, the grace shown by Esau reminds me of the story of the prodigal son. In that, when the prodigal returns to the father runs to him, embraces him, and kisses him. And Genesis 33, verse 4 has very similar language. When Esau meets Jacob, Esau runs to him, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. They both wept. The thing that Jacob had feared for maybe 20 years disappeared. Jacob feared a sword. What he got was an embrace. It's a big moment for both of them. And what happens next? Neither of them actually brought up the past. I don't think that means it's never right to talk about what happened. Maybe you have to do it. It's not saying pretend it never happened. But sometimes the easiest way to reconciliation is to put the past behind you and not dwell too much on it now. The focus is on meeting up and a restoration now after 20 years. Perhaps talking about the past will come later. I'd like to say that it all goes happily ever after between Jacob and Esau. Unfortunately, that's not quite what we read in the rest of Genesis 33. It seems to me that Jacob has a lingering caution. Although Esau wants to accompany Jacob and go together to Seir, which is down in the south, back on my map, Jacob says he'll follow him, but then actually Jacob goes first to Succoth and later to Shechem and finally to Bethel, which is what God had told him. I'm not quite sure what to make of that in terms of their reconciliation. I think, although things have gone pretty well, Jacob is still cautious. It does remind me of the time when Abraham and Lot separated. Although they were relatives and on good terms, they both had sizable flocks, and the land wouldn't support both their flocks living together. So Abraham goes one way and Lot another. They literally give each other space. And maybe this separation between Jacob and Esau is similar. They give each other space. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't mean that trust is instantly restored. Sometimes it needs to include a healthy distance. I do like that going back to that slide, that the chapter rounds off with Jacob setting up an altar in verse 20. It's to give thanks for what God has done. Jacob is looking at it in the light of God's purposes here. God has brought about the reconciliation that Jacob wanted and needed. And he names it El Elohe Israel, which means God is the God of Israel. So just in conclusion, I want to come back to what I said earlier. Maybe there's someone you need to be reconciled with. Someone you fell out with. Maybe you're the one in the wrong and now you need to put things right. Maybe you sense God has been speaking to you about reconciliation. It is not easy. It may be costly one way or another. But if you'd like to talk with someone, pray with someone, please do come speak to one of us after the service. I'll hand over back now to the worship team.